So welcome everybody, and thank you for being here. My name is Carlo Bonini. I'm a journalist from La Repubblica. I will shortly introduce all the people here. We will have a little bit more than an hour to discuss the title of this meeting. We will save the last 15 minutes for questions and answers from the audience. On my left-hand side is Corinne Vella. She's one of the sisters of Daphne in Caruana, Galizia, the investigative journalist killed in Malta on October the 16th of last year. Then we have Peter Bardy. He's the editor-in-chief of Actuality, the online publication where Kuciak, the young Slovak reporter, Jan Kuciak, used to work till he was killed in cold blood by still unknown killers. And then here is Rusbridger. Probably some of you know him. He was for a long time the editor-in-chief of the Guardian, one of the best European newspaper, still one of the best European newspaper. And then Maria Gianniti, my colleague Maria Gianniti from TG1 Rai. Now, the title of this panel is Investigating Links Between Organized Crime and Government. The murders of Daphne Caruana Galizia and Jan Kuciak. I will start this discussion with some figures, with some statistics, recent statistics, regarding the killings of journalists. There are I think, two impressive figures. The first one is that only 4% of cases involving the killing of a journalist is solved, so only 4%, 4 cases out of 100. And the other impressive figures is that unless you could think it's more dangerous, it's to investigate domestic corruption than reporting in war zone, which means that our numbers show that there are more investigative journalists working on domestic affairs killed than war zone reporters. What does it mean, Corinne? What these figures mean to us? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Max. Well, what it means is that we have a problem that we've been ignoring for a very long time. And there is a principle called the tombstone imperative, which is a case of how many people must die before we recognize there is a problem. So we have already, in the space of under 6 months, had 2 assassinations, and both of them at home, quite literally in Jan's case, almost literally in Daphne's case. So when we talked about Daphne's death, people began to wonder if it would happen again. And now that Jan has died, it's not a matter of if it will happen again, but when, to whom, and where. There is a problem, and it has to be recognized. And the figures on impunity show a very serious problem. People are killed at home, the murders are investigated at home. There is obviously a direct correlation between those two statistics. We do not have an international mechanism for protecting journalists. We certainly don't have one for protecting whistleblowers. We need one to protect whistleblowers in the investigations into journalists' deaths. I think this is one of the lessons we have to learn from what has happened to Jan and to Daphne.
Carlos, if you want to, we can, let's say, just switching a little bit among the questions, because I had a long lunch with Corinne, so we tried to point out also the differences that there were between the Malta case, Daphne case, and Jan Kuciak case. It was incredible to see the reaction that there was in Slovakia, while Corinne was telling me that a part of the beginning there was not a strong reaction by the press. So talking with you, Peter, you were the editor-in-chief. You're still the editor-in-chief. The first thing you decided to do is to open all your records and say that was the job Jan Kuciak was doing. Everything is going to be accessible. It's also a way to protect other journalists. Which was the response, which was the reply there by the media in Slovakia? And that's probably something that also Corinne can tell us.
Yeah. First, I have to say two important things. I study English only 1.5 years, so if you will not understand me, please be patiently with me. Second, try to understand me. And first, if I will make mistakes, I'm sorry. And second, very important thing is that I'm very happy that I'm here because I can say one great thank you to all journalists or our colleagues around the world who support us, who called us, who sent emails, because without their support it was very hard for us, and now we see how important is how is it great that we are journalists and that we are in so extremely good family as journalists is. So, and now answer. We opened our Jan's data because we wanted to continue his work. And we are not so huge editorial team, we are only 29, including Jan. So we needed support of other media. And we knew that many of our competitors, they are really excellent journalists. So we opened the data because we wanted to continue in high quality. And the second, as you told, protection. We knew that we can't be selfish, that we can't wait to the end, because Jan is case which everything changed. Yeah. So before Jan's death, all of us wanted to be exclusive, wanted to be #1, and wanted to be famous. But now we know that the best way how to do it is cooperation, and cooperation is way how to change things which we want to change.
I just on this point, just one more thing to Peter. Why do you think that the reaction in Slovakia to the mother of Kuciak was so different from what happened in Malta? I mean, what triggered such a different reaction in your country compared to what happened in Malta?
It's hard for me to explain it because I'm not expert for Malta. But we are very young democracy. We are only 25 years old republic, and we have a gift of communism, and this gift is corruption. So we are still corrupt republic, and if you are growing up in corruption, you are ready to think, you are able to think that that corruption is normal part of your life. And if you are a politician, you can use corruption as a perfect part of for be successful, for have more money, more or higher powerful. But our people, and it's perfect to know that for many of our people, it is not normal or it is not standard. They want changes. They want to live in a normal, standard republic with rules and rights. So they know that it can't be standard to have corruption in government, to have corruption in parliament. And I'm happy when I see 10,000 Slovaks in the streets and on the squares who want changes. So this is the main reason why they are there, because they really want to live in normal democracy of Western European standards, not Eastern European standards.
Alan, you made an investigation about a case of a Ukrainian journalist. Can you tell us something more about it? That, of course, was killed. Can you tell us something more about it, considering Ukraine and what is going on in Ukraine since 2014?
Yes, this is the case of Pavel Sheremet, who was blown up in a car bomb in the center of Kiev just over 18 months ago. And I went there as part of the Committee to Protect Journalists. I'm a member of the board member, and we went to make sure that the case was not forgotten. I mean, I think the context in which we're meeting today is a very dangerous one for journalists. And part of it is the institutional weakness of the press, that anyone who's attended any of the sessions this week doesn't need that point laboured. So you've got an economically weak press that is losing the investigative muscle. And of course you've got the context of the people you would normally turn to, the leader of the free world, who has done his very best to delegitimize journalism. So the places where you would look for support and strength, there is none, and increasingly these two things combine with gangster presidents, gangster prime ministers, and the farming out of the ownership of the press in a very weakened state. And the case of Pavel Sheremet was inspiring in one way, which was that although his murder remains unsolved, what his Ukrainian colleagues did was to investigate his death. And they made a rather brilliant film in which they came up with lots of evidence that the police had overlooked. And it was a very fine piece of investigative journalism. So in terms of the response that journalism can do in a state of weakness, I think there are two things we can do. One is to come together always to investigate the circumstances in which a journalist dies in the course of investigating, as opposed to war or circumstances where it may be more bad luck than deliberate. So that's one thing. And the second is to continue the work that they were doing, which sounds as though happened as described by Peter. So that if any of our colleagues is ever killed, the killers will know that they cannot silence the work.
I just, on this point, I just want to ask Alan, and try to elaborate a little bit more. Corinne was saying before, the problem, I mean, the matter is not who, but where. And what struck in the last 6 months was that Daphne and Daphne and Jan were both European citizens. We used to think that journalists can be killed in third world countries where you have weak democracies, where the audience is, has a different perception of what journalism is, what's the importance or the role of journalism. I mean, what is still, in some way makes me think is that something bad happened to us in the perception that the audience has of journalists. What I mean is, when the organized crime or when a corrupted politician has the feeling that killing a journalist is a price that can be paid because no one will shout for more than a day or 2 days, I think that we have to worry about it, you know? So you were saying what journalists and journalism can do. I'm wondering what audience can do. I explain better. Probably we have been losing trust of the audience in the last few years. I mean, we discussed some months ago the idea that we lost the monopoly of truth. The problem now is that if you consider a journalist no more a journalist, but a sort of a private advocate for a private case or for a party case, then if a journalist dies, who cares? Why should I be worried if a journalist dies? You know? So I'd love to, you know, elaborate a little bit more on this. I mean, I think that Daphne and Jan's death is a sort of wake-up call also for the audience, not only for journalists. I mean, one of the sons of Daphne made a very moving speech in Vienna saying, when a journalist dies, it's not a problem for journalism, it's a problem that, you know, means to each of us as citizens, as European citizens. Daphne is not a Maltese case, is not a domestic case. Jan is not a Slovakian case. They are both something that, you know, that affect our, you know, ourselves as European citizens. Do you agree? Do you think that, you know, this is this is a critical point, something that these two deaths show?
This is a huge subject, yes. The subject's got 10 times bigger in the last 5 minutes. Yes, you're plunging us into the subject of why journalists have lost the trust of the public, which I think is true to a large extent. You know, if you'd been here this morning and heard Jay Rosen speaking, he spoke very eloquently about some of the measures and some of the things that journalists are going to have to do to knit back their relationship with the public that they serve. I've just finished writing a book about news, and I thought it was going to be an easy book to write in the sense it would have a neat ending, that journalism was never more needed. And of course, I believe that. But simultaneously, I think at this moment of the greatest existential threat for journalism, journalism is in a very weak state, partly because of the economic model, obviously, but I think we are failing to make the case for the public interest of what journalism is and what it does. And if we can't make that case, then I'm afraid that you may be right, that people may shrug when journalists die, and they will fail to see each journalistic death as the catastrophe that it is.
I would like to have a question again to both Corinne and also Peter, because they are so different, those cases. Today, this morning in La Repubblica, Carlo Bonini and Giuliano Foschini made a long article about the removal of all the flowers and candles dedicated to Daphne. And this happens regularly, right? It's a sort of way, it's a way of the people saying, we don't want to think about it, and also it's a sort of expression also of the government position, because your government is still in place while we have the resignation of the Slovakia government. And to Peter, there was this big wave Carlo was talking about. We had also 2 Slovak journalists that came into Italy because they wanted to follow the path Jan was was walking to check, to do some fact-checking on, and so to follow Jan's work. At which stage are we now? So, Corinne and then Peter. Talking about what is happening, about all the memorial that has been removed, regularly is removed, has this morning, the article that Carlo Bonini wrote this morning.
I mean, the article in La Repubblica mentions something that happens frequently. On the day that Daphne died, a few young people left some flowers on a public monument, and that became a sort of rallying point for people who want to remember Daphne and people who are asking questions about her death. And it is a place where people gather every 16th of the month. It started informally and has now become a regular practice. So if you want to bury the story, that's one of the places you go. And they bury the story by removing the flowers and the candles and the messages and trying to make it uncomfortable for anybody who goes there to leave anything. And they've tried every possible tactic, from saying we need an official cleanup that's approved by the local council, to saying, well, you know, people who live in Valletta don't want all this rubbish, to saying this is not a grave, and if you want to remember Daphne, why don't you go to the place she died? Which kind of misses the point, because the questions being asked about Daphne's death are not about Daphne alone. Our call for justice as a family is really not just about one family. It is about justice generally, and it is about fundamental rights. There is a right to protest. It's protected by our laws. So people who want to leave a protest message on this memorial are legally free to do so. But it obviously displeases a lot of people because they don't want those questions being asked. So people have been there at night to clean up the whole place, taking everything away, including, most unfortunately, a photograph of Jan Kuciak and Martina Kushnirova. It was left there by people who saw a connection between the two events. So the people who wanted to bury Daphne's story also effectively buried Jan's and Martina's story, which is a very cruel thing to do. But more importantly, it's also an act of ignorance, because the people who remove that are also removing their own right to know, their own right to protest, possibly even their own right to life. Because if you support what happened by your actions, then you're also saying it's perfectly okay to kill me if you disagree with what I say.
But how the press is reacting to all this?
Well, whenever the, it sounds terrible to have to say it, but whenever the memorial is cleared, and that's already been 9 times in less than 6 months, whenever that happens, it becomes a story. So there's a story of the memorial was cleared. Oh, someone's come back to leave some more flowers again. It's become a story in itself. And there's very little about what it means generally, which is, it is a problem of rights not being respected and freedoms not being protected. So yes, the press do cover the story, but they cover it as a story in itself without looking beyond it.
If I have only one word to explain who was Jan Kuciak, I can use the perfect word fact-checker. Fact-checking, it was 80% of his work. So he was data analytic, and today I've met here people who were cooperating with Jan on a story about Italian businessmen in Slovakia. So they know perfectly, or they have more information about him, how it was hardworking and how it was fact-checking. He didn't like emotions in stories. I remember many discussions with him about his articles. I told him it's not good, I need more story, less facts. More story, less facts. And he was like a 5-year-old child. He told me, no, you don't need emotion, you don't need story, you need only facts. So he likes facts, yeah, and if you told about trustworthy of media, I think the best way how to find new trustworthy is to is come back to facts. Less emotions and more facts.
I'd like to try to to pick up one of the things that Corinne was saying before. She mentioned the importance, the urgency for a law regarding whistleblowers, protection of journalists in Europe. I think this is one of the key points. And I try to explain. Daphne, I mean, from my point of view, Daphne started dying when she was left alone, struggling with the legal aggression on different, on foreign jurisdictions, United States, for example, for several millions of dollars. One of the sources of Daphne, the Russian citizen Maria Efimova, started, being arrested when she was alone, facing, sort of multilateral aggression in different countries. Now, I think that, and that's what I'd like to ask to Alan as an observer. I mean, we have been discussing in the last few weeks or months, is the European Commission going to, to put Malta in an highlight? Is going to implement sanctions against Malta for the unrespect of the rule of law? But I think that the question, there is a more important question. Is the European Parliament capable to set a general standard in order to regulate the legal standards in the 27 different countries in Europe regarding, for example, the reputation? Because one of the things you can do is to say, since the organized crime is transnational, you can choose, you can pick up, a comfortable country where you can sue the single reporter. And you can, so as far as we don't have a sort of a general rule that, that make difficult for organized crime or corrupted politicians to harass single journalists where they feel comfortable. I think that we are at square one of this game, of this challenge. Do you think, Alan, that a law protecting whistleblowers and journalists will turn into something similar to the fiscal compact for Europe? So in nothing, because it's difficult to to put together 27 different legislations. I mean, the reputation of an Italian is ruled differently in Italy and than the reputation of an Englishman in the city of London, and it costs also in a different way. I mean, a civil suit, a civil libel in London can cost millions of dollars compared to Italy or France or Greece.
Well, it's undoubtedly true that despite what I said earlier about the attitude of the current president towards the press, America, it seems to me, has a far stronger, more robust protection of free speech than in Europe, though Europe isn't bad, I think, as a whole. I think Article 10 is not the First Amendment, but it's a fairly strong thing, and I would expect that the developing case law in Europe will get stronger, and I think it's a source of one of the many sources of regret in Britain leaving Europe, that the journalists who have wanted that and who tend to focus on Article 8, which is all about privacy, and the restrictions on the press don't give enough credit to the work that has been done across Europe on Article 10 and the protection of free speech. I mean, just tangentially, I think that and sort of building what I was saying earlier about the necessity of journalists to collaborate in uncovering crimes against journalism and in keeping the memory of murdered journalists alive and in doing investigative work. I think that the trend, we've seen it in things like the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, has been towards international collaboration. We did it a bit with WikiLeaks, we did it a bit with Snowden, we did it a bit with the phone hacking on The Guardian. And in each of those cases, it was interesting to think of the American First Amendment as something on which you could harness your journalism. So you mentioned people coming to London to sue for libel. That's called forum shopping. And they come and sue for libel in London because they think that the law will suit them. Well, equally, when we were doing Snowden, when my machines in The Guardian were smashed up by the British state, we just relocated our reporting to New York because we would then benefit from a jurisdiction in which that could never happen because of the Daniel Ellsberg case in 1972. So I think, you know, it's easy to get very gloomy about the situation of journalism, and I can do that too, but I think we can also think about using international legal norms to the benefit of journalism too.
I have one thing, one opinion. We can have the best law in the world. Yeah, we can have great rules, but there are important people who are working with these rules and with this law. So if we have mafia and corruption in justice, in police, in the government, in parliament, we can have best rules around the world, but we will not win. Yeah, there are others who win, and I think that if we want to protect journalists and protect journalism, we need to start with education of people that journalism isn't against people, that the journalism is for people, and I think this is the most important thing for next period, because if we start discussion about trustworthiness of journalism, protection of journalism, we need to explain all students from children that free journalism is one of pillars of democracy. If we really want to live in democratic countries, we need journalism. So we need to protect journalism not because of law. We need to protect journalism because it's important for us.
Peter, coming back to Jan's case, as you were explaining, Jan was doing fact-checking. He was just checking some names for the consortium on investigative journalism. And so he came across some Italian names, names of Calabrian families that probably related to 'Ndrangheta. So when Jans was killed, especially here in Italy, everybody said that there is the 'Ndrangheta. Some said probably there is 'Ndrangheta hands. But who knows 'Ndrangheta knows that this is not the way this organized crime usually operate. So at which stage are we now? Because we know that one of these persons have been arrested again, not on to be questioned on Jan's death, but to be questioned on a different charge because there was a request of arrest coming from Venice. So at which stage are we now as far as Jan's work is concerned? So the problem was that countries like Slovakia, and we saw it also, for example, in Germany when there was the Dortmund case, didn't consider the organized crime as something that can be deeply rooted inside the country. After Jan's case, did you start working on that, trying to understand how the organized crime, also coming from outside Slovakia, is deeply rooted in your country?
Yeah, before Jan's murder, I can't imagine that we have Italian organized crime in Slovakia. I don't want to say that we have Italian mafia or Italian 'ndrangheta in Slovakia, because we don't have information if they are or they are not in 'ndrangheta. And this is one thing what Jan explained to me, that there is different if somebody is in 'ndrangheta or isn't. So now we speak that Mr. Vadala, Mr. Roda, Mr. Chinante and others who make a business in Slovakia, they are with connections to mafia. So it was crazy to know that we have people who are really dangerous, because now we have more information about them, and we know that many of them had problem with justice in Italy because of illegal arming or drug business, etc., etc. So, and what is worse, that all of them, they have connection to our politicians from regional level to high level in Slovakia. But why they are in Slovakia? After Jan's murder, I started to study about 'ndrangheta and about Italian organized crime, and I found out some common things. If you know eastern of Slovakia, it's easy to understand. If not, and if you are from Italy, I can say that eastern Slovakia is a little bit as Sicily in the 70s or at the beginning of 80s. So there is poverty, there is huge unemployment, and if you have a job, your monthly salary is about 500 euros brutto. Also you have, and there is a huge corruption. So if you have, sorry, but Italian know how to do business in Sicily in the 70s or 80s, it was excellent environment for them. So, and there is, in Slovakia is poor country, so we can use Eurofunds, and Eurofunds generally, they are target for organized crime. So we have Italian or we have people with connection to 'ndrangheta in Slovakia.
I just want to add just one thing. It's just a piece of information that I think is quite interesting. We were thinking before when Alan was saying about the legislation. There is a tricky law regarding the Freedom of Information Act. The Freedom of Information Act is one of the key instruments that investigative reporters use in order to get informations from public registers or from institution figures. Now, the law, not only in Italy but almost everywhere in Europe, states that rules that when a journalist uses FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, on a subject or on a company, the subject has to be advised, or the company has to be advised, which is terrible, because, which is terrible, and it's also a nonsense, because if you walk on the street, you don't have a voice telling you how many people and the name of the people staring at you or looking at you. I mean, you're in a public place, and so you are under public scrutiny. So it's quite tricky that when a journalist asks for an access to a semi-public figures or semi-public informations, the object of the information has to be advised. I'm quite persuaded, for example, that Jan Kuciak, one of the problems with Jan, was that when he started to file Freedom of Information Act regarding some companies, single persons, that those persons, those companies were finally advised. And so, you know, they started to look at Jan in a different light. So that was just a piece of information, but I think again it's important because sometimes we forgot that there are many you know, tricky obstacles when you do this kind of journalism. The thing I'd like to ask again regarding journalism and what happened in Jan Kuciak and in Daphne case was how journalism reacted at the very beginning. I mean, before coming here, we were discussing with Corinne. The first reaction of journalism was when Daphne was murdered, was, you know, looking at the family. I mean, the story was a human story. It was not what Daphne had been revealing, but, you know, what the family, I mean, the mourn and the grief of her family. What do you think about it? I mean, did you, I mean, have you had the you know, the time to think why it happened, or do you have an idea why journalism and the first reaction of journalism was this one? It was a way to, you know, to just not looking where it was uncomfortable to look. It was a way to take a shortcut, avoiding, you know, engaging more difficult stories or, you know, public institutions or public figures?
We like to think that journalists are the same everywhere and that journalism culture is the same everywhere, but actually it isn't. As with people generally, you have cultural contexts. So the cultural context of journalism in Malta is that there is very little space for independent journalism. All of the explanations you gave for what happened in Malta are all valid to differing degrees. It is a shortcut to focus on the family. It's also a very human thing to do. People relate to people rather than to facts. And there is far more human interest in looking at a grieving family than there is in looking for a mysterious killer whose identity nobody knows. So yes, it's all of those things, but there's more, because there is a very poor understanding of what the role of journalism really is. It's really not about what readers want to know, it's also about what readers should know. That is its primary function. Because if you only think in terms of what's going to earn you the most clicks or the most interest, or the, you know, taking the shortcut and looking at a grieving family alone, then you're missing the point of what you're meant to do. Yes, the grieving family is a story. I appreciate that. Of course, as being part of that family, it wasn't a welcome intrusion at all. But I do appreciate that people are interested in those kinds of things. But the bigger question is, who did this? And why did they do it? And what does it mean for everybody, not just for us? There are logistical problems in researching those questions. I mean, granted, people were reeling in shock. And when you're in shock, you reach for the shortcut and for the familiar. But there hasn't been any real and concerted effort to look into who possibly did it. There hasn't been that kind of investigation that Alan described. And there certainly wasn't the reaction there was in Slovakia, which was to throw the doors open and work on collaborative journalism. There is a difference between what happened at Aktuality and what happened with Daphne, is that what happened to Daphne happened because of what she wrote on her blog. And her blog was hers and hers alone. Actuality is, has its newsroom, it has a parent company, so there was a machine and a structure in place that could sort of move into action immediately. In our case, I mean, there's a blog, and what next? Who's meant to do anything about it? So on top of the intrusion we had to deal with, of media asking us questions, media wanting our picture, the grieving family, that kind of thing, we also had to deal with the inevitable pressure of people who felt there was a gap in the media spectrum, which Daphne had left, and that it was somehow our responsibility as a family to fill it. And that was one of the most astounding things, is that nobody stepped up and said, right, I'm going to continue where she left off, or let's all do this together. We had to deal with the demands from her reading public that we continue her blog. But her blog was personal, and it led to her death. Why is it our responsibility to follow that same path and possibly get blown up as well? You see, because she worked so much alone on a lot of her stories, it was so easy to take her out. And the message we had there was, well, her blog was personal. It's going to remain as it is. We're not going to add to it. We're not going to take away from it. And it's not our job to fill her shoes. It's everybody's job to fill her shoes. Journalists, yes. I mean, if a journalist left alone fighting, the forces of crime and so on, she was taken out because she was the last line of defense. And now we know there are no more red lines. But it should not have come to that. There are other forces in a democratic society that are supposed to prevent crime. And those institutions weren't working. And the reason they get away with not working is that people tolerate a situation in which those institutions don't work. So you don't have to be a journalist to pick up Daphne's story. You can play your part too as a citizen by calling power to account, by demanding change. And that has happened a little bit since Daphne died. There's more of a civil society movement. More journalists are looking at stories. There is stuff happening, but it's still nowhere near enough. There isn't an organized group of journalists saying, let's look for who did this, even though it is in journalists' interest to do it. It hasn't happened in Malta, not collaboratively. There are individual people following up her stories. There are individual media doing that, but I don't know of any collaborative effort within Malta itself. That's the situation.
Sorry, Corinne. So basically, apart of nobody's investigating, there are no journalists trying to understand who's behind Daphne's death. What you are saying is also that there's nobody that somehow is trying to go on with her work, investigate on what she was investigating.
Not quite. It's just why I said, it's a matter of culture as well. Malta's not a very big country. People know each other. It is very difficult to write about problems at home. We know that. That's why Daphne died. So we do know there is that problem. And it is very difficult to, in the wake of something like that, it is very difficult to go out and ask those questions. When I say there isn't a collaborative effort, I don't say it as a criticism. I say it as a recognition of a situational problem. I mean, if I were working in a newsroom, I would find it very difficult to go out there and say, yes, let's get together and work on this problem. Who would I turn to? And what protection would I have? Look at what happened to Daphne. It would happen to me too. So there is a situational problem. I recognize that. But it is a problem that needs to be fixed.
I have a question for Alan. Daphne was working alone. Jan Kuciak was doing some fact-checking, cooperating with the OCCRP. So there is a project of investigative journalism. In order to protect journalists, there is probably more and more projects like this one to be built up so that the journalists can somehow stay anonymously doing this work. Can be this a solution?
Yeah, I was interested to hear about the attention on the human side of Daphne, and I think that is important too. I mean, it's important that the public see that these are real people with real families, and the devastation that these assassinations leave behind. And I think it's, you know, we have to realize that when something like this happens, it's frightening. It's frightening for those who are, and I'm sure your journalists would not be afraid to admit that they were frightened by this and felt deterred. And that was certainly true in Kiev. You know, a year later, you could sense the shock in that newsroom at what had happened. And they were very candid in saying, all the journalists I spoke to in Ukraine said, privately, of course, we now investigate less, and we're less bold. So exactly what the killers had in mind had been achieved, which I think is the answer to your question, that's bound to be true. And so anything that looks like collaboration, that looks like international collaboration, that uses the most sophisticated techniques of encryption and anonymity if necessary. I mean, I think all journalists are wising up to the fact that they too have a responsibility for their own safety and security, and any journalist who is not wise about how technology can be used to against them is failing in the basics of the craft. So I think what you're saying is really important.
Okay, we have 15 minutes left. So if there are any questions from the audience, they will be more than welcome.
Hello, my name is John Sweeney. I work for the BBC, and I did a film for Newsnight about Daphne, which is on YouTube, and I interviewed the Prime Minister of Malta, Joseph Muscat, and I asked him whether he was not Europe's artful dodger, and he gave a smirk. I also asked him where was he a week after Daphne was murdered, and he couldn't remember, and I reminded him that he was selling passports in Dubai. The point of this is that there is an international globalization threat, a globalized threat to journalism. So at least some of the stories, and we don't know who commissioned the killing of Daphne, but at least some of the evidence points to it could have been people who were connected with organized crime from outside Malta. This was not a local job, many people think. There are a number of theories. I'm not going to go into them right now because of British libel law, for example. But it's a real problem for journalists. I think because what used to be, you could be a local reporter telling your stories locally and fairly and honestly, and there was some level of risk. Now, people like Daphne and Jan are taking on a kind of global mafia, and this makes our job way more difficult.
Thank you. I do remember well that interview, by the way. It was a great interview. I mean, Muscat declined any other interview after that just because it was a disaster for himself. I mean, I don't know if you had the chance just give a look to that interview. I mean, Muscat was flattered at the end. Any other question?
Hello, I'm Peter Bale from the Wiki Tribune, and Matthew used to work for me at the ICIJ, and I really admire the eloquence with which you've spoken today, Corinne. If you go to the web to thesignals.org, there is a new organization created to protect whistleblowers and to give whistleblowers physical, legal, and moral protection. Because if you talk to any whistleblowers about how they've gone after it, they always say, I wish I'd never done it. If I'd known what was going to happen to my life, I would never have done it. But I do think actually putting out a call through that group, which I've just seen if we can try and do, because I think it is surprising to me. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about this, Corinne? I'm just slightly surprised that the Süddeutsche Zeitung and the other partners around the Panama Papers haven't necessarily come down to sort of help investigate in Daphne's murder, or perhaps they have. Could you just elaborate on that at all, if you know?
I don't think it would be fair for me to comment on the ICIJ, but I would like to point out that Matthew, at the time of Daphne's death, Matthew is still a member of ICIJ, and it wouldn't have been fair to expect the ICIJ to involve themselves in an investigation when Matthew was there as well. How do you investigate your own mother's death? That would have been very difficult. So there would have been an internal decision to that effect. About whistleblowers, well, protection of whistleblowers, I think it's perfectly self-explanatory why they should be protected. It's only fair to the whistleblower themselves. It's critical for journalism because without whistleblowers, then you lose important sources. And in the case we're talking about today, where journalists have been killed, whistleblowers are particularly important. How do you protect a whistleblower in the case of investigation of a journalist's death? If the journalist died, what's going to happen to the whistleblower? There has to be some sort of mechanism that is transnational to protect a whistleblower who will talk about a journalist's murder. And very likely that whistleblower is going to be somebody who's a potential source in the stories the journalist was investigating. Or we mentioned the case of Maria Efimova. We all know her name because her name was released. That should never have happened. That's one of the most basic principles. Her name was released by a newspaper, which is one of the most shocking things that can happen. Daphne didn't release her name, she never did. But another newspaper released it. And that made Maria's life really hard. You know, she was a source in a story Daphne was investigating. If there's a potential source in the story of Daphne's death, are they going to come forward? Given what happened to Maria and what's happening to another whistleblower called Jonathan Ferris, I doubt very much anyone would come forward. They can't be sure they'll be protected. In fact, they can be sure that they won't be. There is a huge, huge problem there. But as I said earlier, it's not just a problem in the particular case, it's a problem generally for all of us.
Just on something on the law, I mean, the law is going generally, I mean, it's terrific, Peter, to know that organisation is going to be there, but in most places the law is going in the wrong direction. So many people may have seen the recent film Spotlight about the case of Daniel Ellsberg, and nobody today thinks that Daniel Ellsberg was a traitor, although President Nixon thought so at the time. He's a hero, and that's a case that dates back to 1972. The response to the Snowden revelations in Britain has been to ask a body called the Law Commission to look at the law around these kind of disclosures, and they came up with a really punitive set of recommendations. One is that any editor who did what we did on The Guardian would face very, very long jail sentences, that someone in the position of someone like Edward Snowden and any journalists associated with him would have no defense, and that the definition of the national interest would be dictated by the government of the day. And so those three measures combined would make the kind of whistleblowing that Edward Snowden did and the reporting of it a very dangerous thing for any journalist to do in future. So we have to accept that the law in most countries is getting worse, not better.
Hi, my name is Jana. I'm an American journalist. And my question is for Alan. I know we're talking about Trump and he's this boorish gangster figure, but also Obama was really horrible in terms of whistleblowers and prosecutions. And I know Ryzen is speaking later, and it was Obama's Justice Department that reopened the subpoena. So I'm wondering if really this is a problem that goes back a little bit further even, and if sort of the seeds have been sown a little bit earlier than just in the last year or so.
You're completely right. I think the Obama administration prosecuted 7 whistleblowers, is that right? Which was more than the collective number of all administrations before. And it's great that James Ryzen is here to talk about it.
Any more questions? Vedi mani alzate tu, Carlo.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left. Just want to ask Corinne one last thing. What do you expect from your country? I mean, we have been discussing, what we expect from Europe and from sort of broader community in terms of citizens and journalists. What do you expect from your fellow citizens, from the people in Malta, since you live there, you spend there your life? What do you see now that 6 months have passed?
Is the question what I expect or what I would like to see?
Not you. What do you predict? I mean, what do you predict? What do you expect? What's what you would like to see happen?
Okay, what I would like to see is that what began in the wake of Daphne's death will continue. So that is a renewed interest in civic action, in people understanding their rights and also their obligations, and in better journalism coming out of the system we have to overturn the problems in the journalistic structure we have. More journalists looking for more stories, but also more support for those journalists. It's not fair to expect a journalist to do all the work alone. They need institutional support, they need legislative support, they need mechanisms of protection. And we also need, I'm going to bang this drum again, we also need transnational structures, because if we were talking about covering international crimes, then we also need international structures for protection. You can't do it all alone, and you can't do it at home alone.
So I have a very last question, so at this point for Peter. Peter, at Actuality there were 3 investigative journalists, and Jan was part of this small team. What has changed in Actuality and also in the other newspapers after Jan's death?
Now we have 29 investigative journalists. All of us, before Jan's death, nobody wanted to do his job because you are sitting 10 hours in your office and you are looking for connections between somebody who don't know. And you are not sure what will be at the end of your story, if you find something or not, if you will find something or not. And now I was first who start study some tools which Jan used for his job. So now we have all of my journalists, they are investigation journalists now, because we want to continue in Jan's work, and we want to continue write about corruption in our country. So it's an important part of our job, and we want to do it. What changed? Everything's changing. So I hope that I will never survive something like this, because it's hard for me personally. Jan was my friend, not only my colleague. So before Jan's death, I saw only numbers. Yeah, I saw in column kill journalist free. Yeah, it was only number free, nothing else. I knew stories about them. I knew stories about many of killed journalists, but now I see and now I know how it is hard to live with question if I do everything what I can to protect Jan, and I'm looking for answer. Yeah, now I'm looking for answer if I want to do my job, because I know that I'm editor-in-chief in country where can kill journalists. Yeah, so before Jan's assassination, I thought that I live in the European Union, so I'm protected. I'm protecting, yes. So now I see that I'm not, and my colleagues are not protecting too. So it's really very hard. And the main reason why I'm here in Perugia, it is not that Jan is dead. For me, it is the main reason why I'm here. It is that I want to say I want to say all journalists who want to listen to me that we really need help, that my country really needs help, because our political authorities and people who are responsible for our protection, they didn't do everything what we need. And you know, I need more study English to explain everything what I have in my hand, in my brain, and I want to tell you. So please stay with us and stay with free journalism.
Thank you.
Grazie a tutti.